High above the smoking ruins of the Third Reich in 1944, the air war has become a merciless bloodbath. Hidden away in a top-secret testing facility at Rechlin, a battle-hardened German fighter ace climbs into the cockpit of the enemy's ultimate weapon, an intact, captured American P-51 Mustang. His orders from high command are absolute find its fatal flaw, so the Luftwaffe can bleed the Americans dry. But when the ace finally lands, he doesn't deliver a weakness. He delivers a chilling verdict that drains the blood from his superiors' faces. This is the classified true story of the single test flight that proved the war was already lost. The biting wind, whipping across the tarmac of the Erprobungsstelle, Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier aviation testing facility, carried the bitter scent of synthetic aviation, fuel, and desperation. It was March 1944. The tide of the war had long since turned, crashing back upon Germany with the relentless, drumming thunder of 1,000 Allied heavy bombers every single day. Hauptmann Johannes Seidel stood near the edge of the runway, his leather flight jacket pulled tight against the chill. He was a man aged beyond his 26 years, his eyes framed by the deep, dark circles of perpetual exhaustion. With over 80 confirmed victories claimed over the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front and the bloody skies of the defense of the Reich, Seidel was a survivor. But survival in the Jagdwaffe these days was less about skill and more about the simple, brutal mathematics of probability. He had been pulled from his frontline unit, Jagdgeschwader 54, with no explanation, ordered onto a Junkers Ju 52 transport, and flown directly to Rechlin. He was to report to Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius. Rosarius was a legend in his own distinct, shadowed corner of the war. He commanded the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, the Rosarius Traveling Circus. It was a highly classified unit, tasked with recovering, repairing, and testing captured Allied aircraft. Their job was to fly these enemy machines to frontline fighter bases, allowing German pilots to see their adversaries up close, to understand their blind spots, and to learn how to kill them. "Johannes," a voice called out. Seidel turned and offered a crisp salute as Rosarius approached, flanked by a quiet, imposing figure wearing the distinctive uniform of a general. Seidel felt his heart kick against his ribs. It was Adolf Galland, the general of the fighters, the man holding the impossible burden of defending German airspace. "Herr General," Seidel said, his voice tight with respect. "At ease, Seidel," Galland said, around the ever-present cigar clamped in his teeth. His dark eyes were weary, haunted by the casualty reports that crossed his desk every morning. "Rosarius tells me you have an instinct for energy fighting, that you can feel what a machine wants to do before it even does it." "I try to stay alive, Herr General," Seidel replied evenly. "We need more than survival today," Galland said, gesturing toward a heavily guarded hangar at the far end of the facility. "We need a silver bullet. The Americans have introduced a new fighter. Until now, their bombers, the B-17S and B-24S, flew unescorted over Germany. Our heavy fighters could slaughter them once their Spitfire and Thunderbolt escorts turned back at the Rhine due to lack of fuel. But this new machine, it is appearing deep in our territory. Over Frankfurt, over Schweinfurt." "What is it?" Seidel asked. Rosarius took the lead, walking Seidel toward the hangar. The heavy steel doors groaned as a team of mechanics pulled them apart, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit interior. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was an aircraft of breathtaking, almost alien beauty. It was painted in standard American, olive drab on top, but the entire underside had been repainted in a garish, high-visibility RLM-04 yellow. Bold, black German Balkenkreuz crosses had been painted over the white American stars. Across the fuselage, its newly assigned Luftwaffe code read T9+CK. "The Americans call it the P-51 Mustang," Rosarius said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "An early B model. The pilot got lost, ran out of fuel, and put her down in a farmer's field near Bremen, without so much as scratching the propeller. Our recovery teams had her here in 48 hours. Seidel walked slowly around the aircraft, captivated, unlike the blunt, aggressive snout of his Focke-Wulf 190, or the slender, almost fragile-looking lines of a Messerschmitt Bf 109. The Mustang was a masterpiece of aerodynamic poetry. The nose was impossibly sleek, housing an inline engine. The radiator was slung underneath the fuselage, in a massive, squared-off scoop, a design choice that seemed drag-inducing at first glance, but hinted at complex thermodynamic engineering. "It looks fast," Seidel murmured, running a gloved hand along the leading edge of the wing. He stopped. He frowned and pulled his glove off, tracing the bare skin of his fingers over the aluminum. "The wing. It's too thick in the middle, but the leading edge is sharp, and it's completely smooth. No rivets. A laminar flow wing." A voice echoed from the shadows of the aircraft's tail. A spectacled engineer emerged holding a clipboard. "They've puttied and sanded the rivets flush. The wing profile pushes the thickest part further back. It theoretically reduces parasitic drag to practically nothing at high speeds." "Theoretically?" Galland asked sharply. "We haven't fully tested it in combat conditions, Herr General. That is why Hauptmann Seidel is here." Seidel ducked under the belly, looking at the massive scoop. "What powers it?" "A Packard V 1650, the engineer said. "It's a license-built British Rolls-Royce Merlin, heavily modified with a two-stage supercharger. It runs on their 100-octane aviation fuel. We've managed to siphon enough of their fuel from downed bombers to give you a full tank." Galland stepped up to Seidel, his expression grim. "The High Command, specifically Reichsmarschall Göring, believes this aircraft is a bluff. Göring insists that a single-engine fighter cannot carry enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and still have the maneuverability to dogfight our interceptors. He believes they are stripped down, lightly armed, and flying on fumes by the time they reach us. He thinks they are vulnerable." "And what do you think, Herr General?" Seidel asked, risking the direct question. Galland took a long drag from his cigar. "I think the Americans are not in the business of bluffing, Johannes. I need you to fly it. I need you to push it to the absolute breaking point. Find me its blind spot. Find me the speed at which the controls lock up. Find me the altitude where that engine chokes. I need a weakness to bring back to the Reichsmarschall, or the Luftwaffe is finished." Seidel looked back at the Mustang. The yellow underbelly reflected the harsh hangar lights, casting a sickly, golden glow onto the concrete. It looked like a predatory bird, sleeping in the den of its enemies. "I will fly it tomorrow morning," Seidel said. Dawn broke over Rechlin under a heavy blanket of gray stratus clouds. The air was frigid, biting through Seidel's fleece-lined boots as he walked a slow, deliberate circle around the Mustang on the flight line. Today, he was not just a pilot. He was a diagnostician. Oberleutnant Werner Becker, one of Rechlin's senior test pilots, stood nearby, leaning against the wing of a freshly polished Focke-Wulf 190A8. Becker was to be his sparring partner. The Fu 190 was the pride of the Luftwaffe, a heavily armed, radial-engine brute, known as the Butcher Bird, famous for its devastating roll rate and immense firepower. "Don't break the American toy, Johannes," Becker called out with a tight smirk. "I want to see what it looks like in my gun sight before we tear it apart for scrap." Seidel didn't smile back. He placed his foot into the stirrup and hoisted himself up onto the wing, swinging his leg over the sill of the birdcage-style canopy. As he dropped into the seat, the first shock hit him. The cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was notoriously claustrophobic. A pilot practically wore the airplane, his shoulders touching the canopy glass, the instrument panel shoved right into his chest. But the Mustang's cockpit was cavernous. It was designed for human comfort during long hours in the air. The seat was ergonomically angled. The rudder pedals were wide and accommodating. The control stick grip felt natural, an extension of his own hand. He ran his eyes over the instrument panel. Everything was logically laid out, written in English, which he mentally translated. Altimeter. Airspeed indicator in miles per hour. Manifold pressure. Fuel mixture set, Seidel muttered to himself. Going through the unfamiliar checklist, Rosarius's mechanics had painstakingly translated and taped to the instrument panel. Magnetos on. He pushed the starter switch. The Packard Merlin engine didn't roar to life like the German Daimler-Benz engines. It cleared its throat with a series of sharp, mechanical cracks, belched a cloud of blue-white smoke from the exhaust stacks, and then settled into a smooth, liquid purr. The sound was entirely foreign. It lacked the guttural, aggressive thud of German engineering. It sounded like a precision watch, violently scaled up. Seidel signaled the ground crew to pull the chocks. He eased the throttle forward, and the heavy fighter began to roll toward the runway. Lining up on the concrete strip, Seidel locked the tailwheel. He pushed the throttle steadily forward to military power. The acceleration was not explosive. The aircraft was heavy, loaded with fuel. But as the manifold pressure built, a tremendous, undeniable surge of thrust pushed him back into his seat. The torque pulled the nose hard to the left, forcing Seidel to dance on the right rudder pedal to keep it straight. At 110 miles per hour, the tail lifted. At 130, he gently pulled back on the stick. The Mustang broke contact with the earth. Seidel retracted the landing gear and began his climb. As he passed 10,000 feet, the first stage of the supercharger kicked into its high blower setting with a subtle shift in engine pitch. The air grew thinner, but the Merlin engine didn't seem to notice. It simply kept pulling, dragging the heavy fighter upward with an effortless, relentless energy. Rechlin Tower. This is Seidel. He keyed his radio microphone. Passing 5,000 meters. Handling is surprisingly light. Engine temperatures are nominal. Copy, Seidel. Rosarius's voice crackled back. Becker is climbing to meet you. Proceed to Sector Dora for maneuverability testing. Seidel leveled out at 20,000 feet. The cold gray clouds lay beneath him like a turbulent ocean. Up here, the sky was a piercing, crystalline blue. He looked over his shoulder. The visibility to the rear was slightly restricted by the razorback fuselage behind the canopy. A known flaw the Americans would soon fix, but it was still better than the heavily framed German canopies. A silver flash caught his eye. Becker's view of 190 ripped through the top of the cloud layer. A brutal, snub-nosed killer, banking sharply to fall in line beside him. All right, Johannes, Becker's voice came over the radio. Let's see if that yellow-bellied bastard can dance. Standard intercept parameters. We start at equal altitude and speed. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Brake. Becker slammed his FOV 190 into a violent right-hand diving turn, instantly demonstrating the Focke-Wulf's legendary roll rate. Seidel threw the Mustang stick to follow. The American fighter's ailerons were heavy at this speed, stiffer than the FW 190s, and he couldn't match Becker's initial snap roll. Becker quickly gained the advantage, cutting across Seidel's turn circle and pulling his nose up to achieve a firing solution. He's got me on the initial brake, Seidel thought, his heart rate spiking as combat instincts took over. The Focke-Wulf is a better snapshot killer. Seidel shoved the throttle to the firewall, entering an emergency power setting, and dove. This was where the Mustang revealed its true, terrifying nature. The heavy American fighter dropped like a stone, but as the airspeed needle wound past 350, then 400 miles per hour, the aircraft did not shake. The controls did not turn to concrete. The laminar flow wing, a theoretical curiosity on the ground, became a weapon of physics in the air. It sliced through the atmosphere with practically zero resistance. Seidel pulled back on the stick. The heavy G-forces crushed him into his seat, his vision graying at the edges as he hauled the Mustang out of the dive and into a punishing, sustained, climbing turn. He looked back. Becker had followed him into the dive and was trying to match the climb, relying on the raw horsepower of his BMW radial engine. But the Focke-Wulf, encumbered by its immense aerodynamic drag, was bleeding energy rapidly. The distance between them was opening up. Seidel didn't just climb away. He kept turning. He was leveraging the Mustang's superior energy retention. While the P-190 lost speed in tight turns, the Mustang held onto its kinetic energy like a miser. In less than 2 minutes, the geometry of the fight completely reversed. Seidel came over the top of a looping maneuver, rolling inverted. Below him, Becker's F-190 was hanging on its propeller, struggling to maintain altitude, out of airspeed and out of ideas. Seidel pulled his nose down, dropping right onto Becker's tail. He lined up the German fighter in the American reflector sight. Bang! Bang! Werner, Seidel whispered over the radio. You're dead. There was a long pause on the frequency. Impossible, Becker finally spat. You must have started with an energy advantage. Let's go again. Scissor maneuver. Low speed. They fought for another 40 minutes. They fought at 20,000 feet. They fought down on the deck. They did rolling scissors, flat turns, and vertical spirals. Every single time. The result was the same. The F-190 could outroll the Mustang, and the Bf-109 could outclimb it in a short, steep sprint. But in a sustained dogfight, where energy management was life or death, the Mustang was a flawless apex predator. It never seemed to run out of breath. It could dictate when to engage and when to disengage. It was faster, it retained energy better, and at high altitudes, the Merlin engine turned the aircraft into an untouchable god of the sky. But as Seidel circled back toward Rechlin, reducing his throttle to save the precious captured fuel, he glanced down at the fuel gauges, the internal tanks, the wing tanks. He did the mental math. He calculated the fuel burn rate during the intense, throttle-to-the-firewall combat he had just engaged in. He calculated the distance from the air bases in East Anglia, across the English Channel, over the Rhine, all the way to Berlin. A cold, paralyzing dread settled into the pit of Seidel's stomach. It was a physical weight, heavier than the G-forces he had just endured. He looked down at the sprawling landscape of his homeland, the forests and fields of Germany passing beneath his wings. He realized he was sitting inside the instrument of their annihilation. Rechlin Tower. Seidel is RTB, he said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. The debriefing room at Rechlin was a stark, utilitarian space located deep within the administration bunker. The air was thick and gray, layered with the pungent smoke of a dozen nervous cigarettes and the smell of stale coffee. A large map of Europe dominated the far wall, covered in red and black pins depicting the shifting, shrinking lines of the Reich. Seidel sat at the end of a long wooden table, still wearing his flight suit. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on a notebook in front of him, filled with scribbled calculations and performance graphs. At the opposite end of the table sat Adolf Galland. To his left was Theodor Rosarius. To Gallant's right sat a man who did not belong in an aviation debriefing, Standartenführer Dietrich von Schirach, a liaison from the Reich Aviation Ministry, with close ties to the SS and the Nazi Party's inner circle. Von Schirach wore a sharply tailored black uniform, his expression radiating a haughty, bureaucratic impatience. He was Goering's eyes and ears in the room. Well, Hauptmann, von Schirach began, tapping a silver pen against his leather-bound folder. His voice was smooth but laced with an underlying threat. The Reichsmarschall is eagerly awaiting your report. We have bombers to shoot down, and these new American fighters are becoming a nuisance. Tell us how to swat them out of the sky. Where is the blind spot? How poorly does it handle at altitude? Seidel looked up slowly. He made eye contact with Galland. The general's eyes were guarded, but there was a flicker of something there. Perhaps a shared, terrifying premonition. There is no blind spot, Herr Standartenführer, Seidel said quietly. The room fell instantly silent. The scratching of pens stopped. Excuse me? Von Schirach leaned forward, his brow furrowing. A heavy, single-engine fighter weighed down with enough fuel to reach our borders? It must fly like a brick. It does not fly like a brick, Seidel said, his voice growing firmer. I engaged Oberleutnant Becker in his Focke-Wulf 190, a veteran pilot in our best machine. I defeated him in every single engagement profile. I outturned him. I outran him, and I outdived him. Above 6,000 meters, our fighters will be practically standing still compared to the Mustang. Von Schirach let out a short, dismissive laugh. You exaggerate, Seidel. You are dazzled by a shiny new toy. You are a combat veteran. Surely you know that in a massive furball, numerical superiority and ground control give us the edge. They are at the limit of their range. They must turn back or run dry. Seidel opened his notebook. He slid a piece of paper down the table. It came to rest in front of Galland, who picked it up, his eyes scanning the numbers. Herr Standartenführer, Seidel said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the concrete room. I checked the fuel capacities. I monitored the manifold pressure and the fuel consumption rates at optimal cruise settings. The aircraft holds over 260 gallons internally. If they equip it with external drop tanks, which the wing plumbing clearly indicates, it can take its fuel capacity practically doubles. Seidel stood up, walking over to the map of Europe. He picked up a pointer and tapped the eastern coast of England. Taking off from bases here in East Anglia, Seidel dragged the pointer across the English Channel, across occupied France, across the Rhine. They can cross the border. They can accompany the B-17 bombers. He kept dragging the pointer deep into Germany, past the Ruhr Valley, past Frankfurt. He tapped the pointer hard against the red dot, marking the capital. They can escort the heavy bombers all the way to Berlin. They can drop their external tanks, engage our interceptors at full emergency power for 20 minutes of intense combat, defeat us, and still have enough internal fuel to fly all the way back to England. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a collapsing paradigm. For years, the entire defensive strategy of the Luftwaffe was built on a single geographic reality. Allied fighter escorts did not have the range to penetrate deep into Germany. The strategy was to endure the fighters at the borders, wait for them to turn around, and then unleash the heavily armed, twin-engine Zerster squadrons upon the unescorted bomber streams. It was a bloody strategy, but it was mathematically sound. Seidel had just told them that the math was dead. The bomber streams would never be naked again. That is impossible, von Schirach whispered, the color finally draining from his cheeks. The Reichsmarschall himself assured the Führer that no enemy fighter could ever reach Berlin. It is a technological impossibility. The technology is sitting in Hangar 4, Herr Standartenführer, Seidel replied coldly. The Packard Merlin engine, paired with the aerodynamic efficiency of that laminar flow wing, has solved the range problem. The Americans haven't just built a good fighter. They have built a strategic weapon that completely nullifies our entire doctrine of air defense. The war in the air is lost. Treason! Von Schirach shouted, slamming his fist onto the table, his chair scraping violently against the concrete as he stood up. Defeatism! You will face a firing squad for speaking such poison. Hauptmann. Sit down, von Schirach, Galland barked. The sheer authority in the general's voice cut through the room like a whip. Von Schirach hesitated, glaring at Galland, but slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Galland stared at the piece of paper in his hands for a long time. The cigar in his mouth had gone out. When he finally looked up, he looked 10 years older. Johannes is right, Galland said softly. I have seen the combat reports from the frontline squadrons over the past 2 weeks. The casualty rates of our heavy fighter units are skyrocketing. We thought the Americans were just pushing their P-47s past the safety margin. But it is these Mustangs. They are sweeping the skies ahead of the bombers. Galland looked at von Schirach. If we do not adapt immediately, if we do not switch entirely to producing jet fighters, like the Me-262, to counter this speed, and altitude. The Luftwaffe will be completely eradicated within 6 months. Von Schirach sneered. The Me-262 is a bomber, by order of the Führer. And I will not allow this hysterical defeatism, to leave this room. Do you understand what this report will do to the morale of the Jagdwaffe? If our boys believe they are facing an invincible machine that can hunt them over their own airfields, they will break. Von Schirach stood up, gathering his papers. He walked over to Seidel, his eyes cold and dead. You will rewrite this report, Hauptmann, the SS liaison ordered. You will state that the Mustang is heavy, sluggish in a climb, and vulnerable to dive attacks. You will highlight the weakness of its liquid-cooled engine to defensive fire. You will write a manual on how to defeat it, and you will teach it to the new cadets. If the truth of this fuel capacity gets out, I will personally see to it that you and your family in Dresden are investigated for subversion. Von Schirach turned and marched out of the room, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him. Seidel stood frozen, looking at Galland. The general of the fighters simply closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Do what he says, Johannes, Galland whispered, the fight completely drained from him. Write the lie. Give them a fake weakness. Let the boys die with hope in their hearts rather than terror. Seidel walked out into the freezing night air of the Rechlin base. He looked up at the moonless sky. He knew what he was ordered to do. He was ordered to lie to his comrades, to send young men in inferior machines into the teeth of an unstoppable buzzsaw, armed with false tactics that would get them slaughtered. But as he pulled his coat tight against the cold, a dangerous, treasonous thought crystallized in his mind. He would write the official report. He would satisfy von Schirach, but he was going to take the Mustang on one more test flight, and he was going to make sure the real truth reached the men who needed it, no matter the cost. The morning frost clung to the edges of the Rechlin concrete, sparkling like crushed glass under the pale, anemic sun. The ground crew had already been at work for hours, their breath pluming in the freezing air as they fueled and armed the captured P-51 Mustang. Hauptmann Johannes Seidel stood in the shadow of the hangar, watching the mechanics top off the American fighter's massive internal wing tanks. In his heavy leather pocket rested a folded piece of paper. It was the preliminary draft of his official evaluation, written late into the night under the watchful, unblinking eye of Standartenführer von Schirach's adjutant. It was a masterpiece of lethal fiction. In it, Seidel had written that the Mustang's laminar flow wing was highly susceptible to ice accumulation, rendering it sluggish at bomber altitudes. He had fabricated a tendency for the Packard Merlin engine to overheat in a sustained climb, and he had explicitly stated that its maximum combat range, while impressive, would still force the American fighters to turn back at the Rhine if they engaged in any defensive maneuvering. It was exactly what the High Command wanted to read. It was a document that would condemn hundreds of German pilots to death. She is ready, Herr Hauptmann, the chief mechanic, a grizzled veteran named Fischer said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. We patched a small leak in the coolant line. She purrs. Thank you, Fischer, Seidel said, his voice hollow. He walked out to the aircraft, the yellow-painted underbelly practically glowing in the morning light. Theodore Rosarius was waiting by the wing root, looking deeply uncomfortable. He knew what was in the report. Everyone in the command structure of the Wanderzirkus knew. Just a standard handling flight today, Johannes, Rosarius said quietly, not meeting Seidel's eyes. Take her up to 6,000 meters. Run through the basic aerodynamic checks for the official logbook, and bring her down. Keep it within the Rechlin perimeter. Of course, Herr Hauptmann, Seidel replied, climbing up the wing. He paused at the edge of the cockpit and looked down at Rosarius. The men on the front line, the Jagdgeschwader commanders. They are going to fly against these things, thinking they have the advantage in a dive. It is out of our hands, Seidel, Rosarius whispered fiercely, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. Von Schirach has already transmitted the summary to Berlin. If you deviate from the script now, You aren't just a dead man. You are a traitor to the state. Just fly the plane." Seidel nodded once, a sharp, mechanical motion. He dropped into the cavernous American cockpit and strapped himself in. He ran through the ignition sequence. The Merlin engine coughed, spat a ring of blue smoke, and settled into its rhythmic, ticking roar. As he taxied out to the active runway, Seidel reached into his pocket. He pulled out the falsified report. He stared at it for a long moment, watching the heavy black ink that spelled out the doom of his comrades. With slow, deliberate movements, he tore the paper in half, then in quarters. He opened the small side vent window of the canopy and shoved the scraps out into the slipstream. They scattered across the tarmac like dirty snow. He locked the tail wheel, pushed the throttle forward, and the heavy fighter surged down the runway. The moment the landing gear tucked itself into the wings, Seidel did not enter the standard climbing turn that would keep him within the Rechlin test airspace. Instead, he pulled the stick back, aiming the nose of the Mustang toward the western horizon, and pushed the throttle past the maximum continuous cruise setting. He was heading for the Ruhr Valley. He was heading for the frontline bases of Jagdgeschwader 1, the men tasked with defending the industrial heart of Germany. If the brass in Berlin wouldn't listen, he would deliver the warning directly to the wing commanders, who were sending the boys up to die. Seidel. Rechlin Tower. The radio crackled in his headset. It was Rosarius, his voice tight with panic. "You are breaking your designated flight vector. Come to heading 090 immediately." Seidel ignored it. He kept the nose pointed west, passing through 10,000 feet, the supercharger kicking in with its familiar, powerful whine. "T9 plus CK, this is Rechlin Tower. Respond immediately." The voice on the radio changed. It was no longer Rosarius. The smooth, venomous tone of Standartenführer von Schirach filled Seidel's ears. "Hauptmann Seidel, you are currently in violation of direct orders. You are flying a classified, captured aircraft toward the Western Front. Turn that machine around this instant, or you will be classified as a defector attempting to desert to the Allies." Seidel finally reached for the transmit button. "I am not defecting, Standartenführer. I am a German officer. I am taking this aircraft to Oberstleutnant Kessler at JG-1. The frontline commanders need to see what this machine can do before you order them to their slaughter." "You arrogant fool," von Schirach hissed over the static. "You think a frontline commodore will listen to a mutineer? You are flying a yellow-bellied airplane with enemy lines right under its paint. I am giving you one last warning, Seidel. Turn back." "The report you forced me to write is a death sentence for the Jagdwaffe," Seidel replied, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands gripping the control stick with white-knuckled intensity. "I will not let my brothers die for Goering's vanity. I am delivering the truth. Then you will deliver it in hell." The radio went dead with a sharp click. Seidel exhaled a shaky breath. He had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back to Rechlin. There was no going back to his old life. He was a man without a squadron, flying a stolen enemy fighter over his own heavily defended country. He checked his map, strapped to his thigh. He was roughly 20 minutes away from the airfield at Dortmund. He just had to maintain his speed and altitude. 10 minutes later, his peripheral vision caught a glint of sunlight high above him, at his 6 o'clock position. Seidel twisted violently in his seat, straining his neck to look past the armor plating behind his head. High in the contrail layer, plunging out of the sun, were 4 distinct silhouettes. They had the blunt noses and broad wings of Focke-Wulf 190s. They were not test pilots. They were the alert scramble flight from a nearby defense sector, and they were diving straight for him. The adrenaline hit Seidel like a physical blow, sharpening his vision to a terrifying clarity. The 4 Fu-190s were moving with lethal, coordinated precision, a perfectly spaced swarm, executing a classic bounce. Von Schirach hadn't just reported him as a defector. He had ordered him shot down. Seidel slammed the throttle all the way forward to the firewall, breaking the safety wire on the emergency manifold pressure override. The Packard Merlin roared in protest, shaking the airframe as it flooded the cylinders with high-octane fuel, generating well over 1,500 horsepower. "Brake, brake, brake," Seidel muttered to himself, hauling back on the stick and kicking the right rudder pedal. The captured Mustang snapped into a brutal, gut-wrenching turn, just as the lead Focke-Wulf opened fire. Tracers, thick, glowing basketballs of 20 millimeters, Meningeskos, high-explosive shells, ripped through the airspace, exactly where Seidel's cockpit had been a fraction of a second earlier. The thunder of the enemy cannons, his own countrymen's cannons, was a horrifying sound. Seidel came out of the turn inverted, pulling the nose down to trade altitude for airspeed. The Focke-Wulfs blew past him, their massive radial engines howling, unable to match his sudden, erratic change in direction at that speed. "Think," Seidel ordered himself, fighting the crushing G-forces as he rolled the aircraft upright. "They are my brothers. I cannot shoot them. I just have to outfly them." He checked his 6 o'clock again. The German flight leader was already reversing his turn, using the few 190's superior roll rate to snap back onto Seidel's tail. The other 3 fighters were fanning out, creating a net to trap him. "Yellow belly. This is leader." A voice suddenly cracked over the universal emergency frequency. "You are ordered to lower your landing gear and follow us to the nearest airfield, or you will be destroyed." "Leader, this is Hauptmann Seidel of the Erprobungsstelle." Seidel transmitted back, his breathing heavy. "I am carrying classified intelligence for J.G. Ines. Break off your pursuit." "We have our orders, traitor," the voice came back, hard and uncompromising. "You have 10 seconds. Seidel didn't bother replying. He knew the mindset of the Jagdwaffe. Orders were absolute. They believed he was stealing a highly classified asset for the enemy. The lead Focke-Wulf closed the distance, its nose pulling up for a firing solution. Seidel watched the distance shrink in his rearview mirror. 600 meters. 500. Instead of turning to avoid the fire, Seidel initiated the very maneuver he had warned the high command about. He pushed the nose of the Mustang down into a steep, terrifyingly fast dive. The heavy American fighter accelerated with horrifying speed. The airspeed indicator whipped past 350, then 400, then 450 miles per hour. The Earth rushed up to meet him in a blur of gray and green. Behind him, the Focke-Wulf pilot followed, determined not to lose his prey. But as they passed 480 miles per hour, physics took over. The blunt nose and thick wings of the German fighter slammed into a wall of aerodynamic drag. The controls of the 4W190 began to stiffen, the stick turning to unyielding concrete in the pilot's hands as compressibility set in. Seidel, however, was flying the laminar flow wing. The Mustang sliced through the thick, low-altitude air like a scalpel. He didn't experience the violent shuddering. He didn't lose control. He simply kept going faster. He glanced back. The Focke-Wulf was falling behind, its pilot fighting desperately to pull out of the dive before his aircraft buried itself in the German countryside. The other 3 fighters had wisely broken off their pursuit higher up, realizing they could not match the dive speed. Seidel hauled back on the stick at 3,000 feet. The G-forces were immense, pulling the blood from his brain, graying out his vision. The Mustang's wings groaned under the immense load, but the airframe held together. He leveled out, screaming across the treetops at over 400 miles per hour, leaving the interceptors miles behind him. He had just practically demonstrated the lethal superiority of the American machine, nearly killing himself in the process to prove a point. His fuel was burning fast at emergency power, but the concrete strip of the Dortmund airfield, home to Jagdgeschwader 1, finally appeared on the horizon. Seidel chopped the throttle, the sudden deceleration throwing him forward against his shoulder harnesses. He dropped the heavy landing gear and the flaps. As he approached the airfield, he saw the anti-aircraft batteries, the dreaded Flak 38 quad cannons, swiveling their barrels toward him. To them, he was an American fighter coming in low and fast. Seidel frantically triggered his landing lights and rocked his wings, displaying the high-visibility yellow underbelly and the massive German crosses painted on the fuselage. Dortmund Tower. This is Luftwaffe test, aircraft T9 plus CK. Declaring an emergency landing, Seidel yelled into the radio. Hold your fire. I am a German aircraft. Hold your fire. For 3 agonizing seconds, he waited for the sky to erupt in flak. He braced for the impact of high explosive shells tearing the Mustang apart. But the sky remained clear. The flak gunners, confused by the vivid German markings on the enemy silhouette, hesitated just long enough. Seidel's tires slammed onto the concrete runway, squealing in protest as he applied heavy braking. He taxied the aircraft off the main strip, bringing it to a halt near a cluster of camouflage netting and dispersed hangars. Before the propeller even stopped spinning, he saw them. 2 Kubelwagen utility vehicles were tearing across the grass toward him, followed by a squad of Luftwaffe field police, with their MP-40 submachine guns raised. The base had obviously been alerted by von Schirach. Seidel unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking violently from the adrenaline crash. He pushed the canopy back and slowly stood up in the cockpit, raising his hands in the air. The military police surrounded the aircraft, their weapons aimed directly at his chest. From the lead vehicle, a tall, severe-looking officer in a leather coat stepped out. It was Oberstleutnant Erich Kessler, the Commodore of JG-1. He looked at the captured Mustang, and then up at Seidel, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Hauptmann Seidel," Kessler said, his voice carrying over the wind. "I have just received a teletype from Reich Aviation Ministry Command. They inform me you are a traitor attempting to defect. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't have my men shoot you right there on the wing." Seidel looked down at the barrels of the guns. He took a deep breath of the cold, oil-scented air. "Because, Herr Oberstleutnant," Seidel said, his voice ringing out clear and steady, "I am the only man in Germany who knows how you and your pilots are going to die tomorrow, and I came to tell you how to stop it." Oberstleutnant Erich Kessler did not lower his Luger. The wind, howling across the Dortmund airfield, whipped the skirts of his leather coat, but his arm remained perfectly steady. Around him, the men of Jagdgeschwader, the defenders of the Reich's industrial heartland, watched the captured American fighter with a mixture of awe and deep, simmering hostility. "You have exactly 1 minute, Hauptmann," Kessler said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "before I decide to enforce the treason warrant myself. Why did you steal this machine?" Johannes Seidel slowly lowered his hands, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He stepped off the wing, his boots hitting the concrete with a heavy thud. He ignored the military police and walked directly toward Kessler, stopping only when a guard thrust the barrel of an MP-40 into his chest. "Because Berlin is lying to you, Herr Oberstleutnant," Seidel said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines of nearby trucks. "Standartenführer von Schirach and the Reichsmarschall are preparing to issue a tactical bulletin regarding this aircraft. They will tell you it is heavy. They will tell you it performs poorly, above 6,000 meters. They will tell you it cannot reach the Ruhr Valley with enough fuel to dogfight." Seidel pointed a gloved finger back at the yellow-bellied Mustang. "They are lying to protect their political standing. If you send your men up against that machine, using the tactics Berlin suggests, you will lose your entire Geschwader in an afternoon." Kessler narrowed his eyes. "And why should I believe a man who disobeys a direct order and flies an enemy aircraft over our own flak batteries?" "Because you are already losing men, Erich," Seidel shouted, dropping the formal titles, appealing to the brotherhood of the Jagdwaffe. "Look at your casualty boards. For the last 2 weeks, your high-altitude patrols have been getting bounced by a fighter you couldn't identify. A fighter that dives faster than a Focke-Wulf and retains energy like a Messerschmitt. Look at it." From the crowd of pilots who had gathered behind the military police, a figure stepped forward. It was Major Heinz Baer, a legendary ace with over 200 victories, his face scarred and his eyes weary. He walked past the guards, ignoring Kessler's warning look, and approached the Mustang. Baer ran his hand along the smooth, rivetless, leading edge of the wing. He ducked underneath, examining the massive radiator scoop and the intricate plumbing for the underwing drop tanks. Finally, he climbed up onto the wing root and looked into the cockpit, reading the fuel gauges. The silence on the tarmac stretched into agonizing seconds. Bear climbed down and walked slowly back to Kessler. The veteran ace looked physically sick. "He's telling the truth, Commodore," Bear said quietly, though his words carried an immense weight. "The internal tanks are massive. With external drop tanks, this thing has the legs to fly from London to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes at full emergency power, and fly home. It's not a point defense fighter. It's a deep penetration escort." Kessler lowered his pistol, the color draining from his face. "If they can escort the heavy bombers all the way to the capital, the entire defense grid is compromised." "It's worse than that," Seidel pressed, seeing the realization dawning on them. "The wing profile. It's laminar flow. In a dive, it does not suffer from compressibility lockup the way our Focke-Wulfs do. If your boys try to dive away from it to escape, the Mustang will simply run them down and shoot them in the back. You cannot outrun it. You cannot outdive it. And above 20,000 feet, the Packard Merlin engine will allow it to outturn you." Mutters of disbelief and fear rippled through the gathered pilots. These were hardened killers, survivors of years of aerial meat grinders. But the sheer technological superiority described by Seidel struck a nerve of existential dread. "What are its weaknesses?" Bear asked, his tactician's mind already searching for a way out of the trap. "Its liquid cooling system," Seidel answered immediately. "The radiator under the belly is massive and vulnerable. A single stray bullet into the coolant lines will seize the engine in minutes. And in a slow-speed, horizontal turning fight on the deck, a well-flown Bf-109 can inside turn it. But the American pilots won't fight you there. They will use their speed to dictate the engagement. You have to force them into head-on passes or attack the bombers from the frontal quarter and dive through their formations before the Mustangs can react." Kessler looked at the torn, heavily annotated map strapped to Seidel's leg. He looked at the exhausted, desperate face of the test pilot who had thrown his life away to deliver a warning. "You are a dead man, Johannes," Kessler whispered. "You know that. Even if I believe you, the Gestapo will be here within the hour. Von Schirach will not let this humiliation go unpunished." "I am already dead," Seidel replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "But your boys are still alive. Teach them what I just told you. Update the tactical manuals yourself. Ignore Berlin." The sound of screeching tires interrupted them. At the far end of the tarmac, a convoy of 3 black Mercedes staff cars burst through the main gate, ignoring the sentries. They tore across the runway, heading straight for the gathering around the Mustang. "SS," Bear spat, his hand instinctively dropping to the holster at his hip. The cars slammed to a halt, boxing in the captured fighter. The doors flew open, and a dozen men in the black uniforms of the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence agency of the SS, poured out, leveling M-Pak-32 submachine guns at the Luftwaffe personnel. From the lead car, a tall, gaunt man with a heavily scarred cheek stepped out. He wore the rank tabs of a Sturmbannführer. "Oberstleutnant Kessler," the SD officer barked, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "I am Sturmbannführer Brandt. You are harboring a state traitor. Order your men to stand down and hand over Hauptmann Seidel immediately." Kessler did not move. He glanced at Bear, then at the young, terrified faces of his pilots. He looked back at Brandt. "Hauptmann Seidel is a Luftwaffe officer. Sturmbannführer," Kessler said, his voice dangerously calm. "He is under my jurisdiction on this base." Brandt sneered, walking forward until he was inches from Kessler. "He is an enemy of the state, ordered executed by Standartenführer von Schirach and the Reichsmarschall himself. Furthermore, I have orders to seize that aircraft and destroy it. It is a vector for defeatist propaganda." "Destroy it?" Major Bear yelled, stepping forward. "That is the most vital piece of technical intelligence we have captured this year. It holds the key to saving our pilots." Brandt drew his sidearm and pointed it directly at Bear's chest. "Step back, Major, or I will shoot you where you stand." The aircraft is a lie. The Führer has declared our airspace impenetrable. This machine is an American psychological trick. The tension on the tarmac snapped tight like a piano wire. A dozen SS weapons were aimed at the German pilots. But slowly, inevitably, the distinct clack-clack of bolts being racked echoed across the concrete. The Luftwaffe military police, who had moments ago been holding Seidel at gunpoint, had shifted their MP-40s. They were now aimed point-blank at the SS troopers. Behind them, several pilots had drawn their service pistols. "You are on a frontline fighter base, Sturmbannführer," Kessler whispered, his eyes locking with the Gestapo officers. "My men die every single day defending this airspace while you sit in bunkers hunting phantoms. If you fire that weapon, you and every one of your black shirts will be hosed off this runway before your brass casings hit the ground." Brandt looked around, realizing he was severely outgunned by men who had long ago lost their fear of death. His jaw tightened, but he slowly lowered his pistol. Before the standoff could resolve, a terrifying, rhythmic wail began to echo across the airfield. It started low, a mournful groan, before rising into an ear-splitting, mechanical scream. The air raid sirens. Incoming bombers. 3 streams, 24,000 feet. The warning shattered the airfield's tense silence. In an instant, everything changed. "Scramble all flights," Kessler barked. "Bear, take first group of intercept now." Pilots sprinted across the tarmac. Engines roared to life in choking bursts of smoke and flame. The air vibrated with urgency. Brandt grabbed Kessler's sleeve. "Seidel is under arrest." Kessler shoved him off. "Then go arrest him in the sky." Seidel stood still amid the chaos, eyes fixed on the horizon. "If you stay, they'll shoot you," Kessler warned. Seidel nodded once. "Then I fly." Moments later, he was racing toward Hangar 3. The Focke-Wulf inside waited like a coiled beast. He climbed in, hands moving with practiced certainty, sealing himself into the cockpit. The engine ignited beneath him with a violent shudder. Seconds later, he was airborne, climbing into a sky already filling with death. At 15,000 feet, the formation leveled out. Then they saw them. The bombers came first, hundreds of B-17s, flying in tight, impenetrable formations. A wall of guns, a fortress in the sky. Above them, worse, Mustangs. Dozens of sleek fighters circling high, waiting. "Execute Seidel's protocol," Kessler's voice snapped over the radio. "No diving, no climbing fights." The German formation broke apart, diving toward the bombers. The Mustangs answered instantly. They dropped like predators. One latched onto a Focke-Wulf ahead of Seidel. The pilot panicked, diving. Too late. The Mustang accelerated, closing the distance effortlessly. A burst of fire, and the German fighter disintegrated midair. "Do not dive," Seidel shouted. "Break roll." A shadow fell over his cockpit. He twisted around. A Mustang was already on him. No fear, only calculation. He rolled hard, violent, sudden. The heavy Focke-Wulf snapped sideways. The Mustang overshot, too fast to adjust. Seidel reversed instantly. For a heartbeat, the American's underside filled his sights. He fired. The cannons thundered. Shells tore into the Mustang's belly. White coolant burst into the air like smoke. The engine died. The pilot bailed out. "Good hit," Bear called. "Stay sharp." The sky dissolved into chaos. Planes twisted, burned, fell. Tracers stitched the air. For every enemy hit, more replaced them. Seidel fought with cold precision, forcing engagements where his aircraft still held an edge. Rolling, turning, surviving. Then, impact. His aircraft shuddered violently. A burst of fire tore through his wing, shredding metal and instruments alike. Pain exploded through his shoulder. The controls went slack. "I'm hit," he gasped. "Controls gone." "Bail out," Kessler shouted. Smoke filled the cockpit. The plane dropped into a spiral. Seidel reached for the canopy release. It tore away, and the wind hit him like a wall. He forced himself up, fighting the crushing pull of gravity. For one final moment, he looked out. The sky was filled with American aircraft. Unstoppable. He understood then. This wasn't a battle. It was the end. Seidel pulled himself free and fell into the open air, the burning wreck of his fighter spiraling beneath him. His parachute snapped open. Below, the forests of Germany waited in silence. Above, the war moved on without him. The test flight of the captured P-51 Mustang at Rechlin represented a pivotal, devastating revelation for the German High Command. Historically, while captured Allied aircraft were extensively tested by the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, the sheer strategic shock of the Mustang's capabilities was often suppressed by leadership, unwilling to admit the collapse of their defensive doctrine. The introduction of the P-51, combining the aerodynamic brilliance of the laminar flow wing with the fuel efficiency and high-altitude power of the Packard Merlin engine, decisively shifted the balance of power in the skies over Europe. It solved the Allied range problem, allowing escorts to accompany heavy bombers anywhere in the Reich. For the veteran pilots of the Jagdwaffe, facing these technologically superior numbers, while burdened by the delusions of their superiors, every flight became a desperate, doomed struggle against inevitable defeat, defined by tragic courage in a lost cause.